Hello again. I'm well aware that I've covered the subject of the supposed Africans in Roman Britain before, but it's now something which one encounters so often that most people simply assume as a matter of course that there must be something in the idea, simply because they encounter it everywhere. I'll give a simple example in the description to this video, which is from the English Heritage website. Click on the link and you will read, simply stated as though it were a fact, there is evidence of African people in Roman Britain as far back as 3rd century AD. Well, what evidence is being referred to here, do you think? There have been crank books on this subject for some years. I mean, there was a particularly famous one in the early 80s. But it really entered the mainstream, the idea about black people in Roman Britain, and became respectable among ordinary folk with the publication of this book, which is Black and British: A Forgotten History, and it is, of course, by David Olusoga. It was first published in 2016. This is a paperback edition from 2017, and it contains all the evidence upon which people rely. Every bit of evidence about the idea of there being black people in Roman Britain is contained in this book, which was, by the way, very well received. Well, well received among some people. For example, the Sunday Times said, written with a wonderful clarity of style and with great force and passion. I wonder who did that review. Oh, wait, that was Kwasi Kwarteng, for a short while Chancellor of the Exchequer in this country. According to the Observer, a classic in every sense of the word, should be compulsory reading. And the man that did that review for the Observer was John Sentamu, formerly Archbishop of York. So it's probably fair to say it was very well received by black people, and a lot of middle class and left wing white people feel they have to go along with the ideas contained in it for that reason. Let me first point out a bit of linguistic sleight of hand which is played both in this book and elsewhere when the topic comes up, which is that although this book is called Black and British, Africans are referred to as though they were all black, which is absurd. In other words, the word African and the concept of black people is simply used interchangeably. In other words, Olusoga refers to African people, knowing that many readers will automatically assume that by this he is referring to black Africans, because the book is, of course, about black people. So it is that he mentions that a unit of the Roman army called the Aurelian Moors was stationed at Hadrian's Wall. Many of us have heard of this. These Moors, though, were not black people from modern-day Mauritania, which is a country in sub-Saharan Africa, but they came rather from the North African colonies in what is now Algeria and Morocco. Rome had colonies there. The inhabitants were Berbers, whom the Romans called Mori. They weren't black, but they were rather like modern Bedouin. Olusoga mentions them in this book on page 29 and 30 of this particular paperback edition. That is one piece of supposed evidence of which we have all heard, and it does not concern black people at all. He then moves on to some Roman skeletons in York that a man in the 1980s thought were black people because, let me see, among the skeletons were several whose limb proportions suggested that they were black Africans. Well, that's not very strong evidence, really. This is pseudoscience, and I'll return to that subject shortly. Olusoga then says that modern archaeology has confirmed this. He talks about the isotope found in the skeletons, a technique that uses oxygen and strontium isotopes to detect chemical signatures in bones and teeth. True, this allows archaeologists to determine where individuals originated and where they spent their childhood years. Yes, that's true, because strontium and oxygen enter the skeleton, and particularly the teeth, when the teeth are being formed, according to the geology of an area and according to what people have been eating, drinking, and the air that they've been breathing. So, yes, that's absolutely correct. He then goes on, after mentioning strontium and oxygen, to say that, where are we now? The remains of those citizens of Roman York were subjected to isotope analysis, and while most of those examined displayed European ancestry, 11 to 12% proved to have been of African descent. This is completely mad. Testing the isotopes of strontium and oxygen won't enable you to determine anybody's ancestry or descent at all. They will rather tell you where that person grew up. In other words, where they were when their teeth began to form. It doesn't tell you anything whatever about ancestry. So, roughly 1 in 10 of those skeletons were formed, they were the skeletons of people who had grown up in North Africa. This is nothing at all to do with their ancestry, though. They were Romans living in the Roman colonies there. To give a modern example, imagine for a moment that if Richard died and we examined his skeleton, well, we would find immediately, if you by analysing his teeth for the strontium and oxygen isotopes, that he had been born and brought up in India, at Lucknow. That would tell you where he was born and where he was brought up. It wouldn't tell you anything about his ancestry. His ancestry is completely English, you see. It just so happens that he was born in a British colony in India. And in the same way, those skeletons that had those particular isotopes from North Africa, it doesn't tell you that they were North African at all. It tells you that they were brought up in a Roman colony. So that's another piece of supposed evidence. Then he goes on to talk about um, forensic. Where are we now? Isotope isotope analysis has worked best when combined with craniometrics, the measuring of details and proportions of the human skull. Right, well, that's actually something like phrenology, because he then tells us about Beachy Head Lady. And there's a photograph here of a reconstruction. This was a Roman skeleton found near Eastbourne in Sussex. Here's a reconstruction of Beachy Head Woman. You see, gosh, she's been reconstructed as a black African, hasn't she? Because it appears that some expert looked, where are we now? Professor Caroline Wilkinson, a leading figure in the field, was able to tell merely by looking at the skull, and before she had begun the minute measurements that underpin her work, that the skull of the Beachy Head Lady was that of a sub-Saharan African. Of course, that's complete nonsense. DNA testing at the Crick Institute showed that she had actually been, uh, her ancestry was Southern European, probably from Cyprus. Absolutely nothing at all to do with Africa in the slightest. That's it. I have now gone through every piece of evidence that there were black people living in Roman Britain. There is no evidence. The whole thing is a nonsense. That's the whole sum of it. I don't know whether David Olusoga is misleading people deliberately in order to promote a particular idea, or whether he's simply ignorant. But the fact is that all this is the foundation for the belief in black people living in Britain 2,000 years ago. There isn't any. The evidence is literally non existent.